Welcome to Books on Point. Wandile Sihlobo spent his school holidays in the rural Eastern Cape, studied agricultural economics at university, and has worked in private sector agriculture, consulting with farmers across the country. His debut book, Finding Common Ground, is a selection of key articles from his regular Business Day column, framed with insightful commentary and context. The book covers the broad themes that have marked current discussions and outlines the challenges and opportunities faced by South Africa's agricultural sector. We had this conversation. Wandile, thank you so much for your time. Let's talk about the inspiration behind the book, and perhaps you can let us in on why you decided to go with the format that you did.
Thanks for having me on. Common Ground. I would say the book on itself, it's really, the idea was to make sure that agriculture becomes part of a day-to-day conversation amongst ourselves, and really for a few basic reasons. The first one is for people to understand the value that the sector plays on the economy broadly. We might have a sense of where the economic opportunities are, and also that it is important for our food security, but I think there are some intricacies of the industry and also some of the opportunities that we can still really exploit in terms of contributing to job creation and the other things. So that was one part of the reason on that. And the second part is that we're really coming on to talk about land reform and the other policies that get to drive this agricultural sector in South Africa. The idea was, again, to weigh in and express some of the views that I have about this sector and where the direction should actually be going on to that. But how I approached it was really linked to the work that I do at Business Day, which is really being a columnist. And when you're a columnist, you're discussing all of these things in various short stories. And then in the book, I thought, okay, these columns have some sort of a thread on what discussion that get to have at a certain particular time, driven by particular events. And the idea was really to make it thematic on those and cover all of the areas that I felt that they were important on driving the sector and also the future going forward. And that's how we really came up to put the book in the format that it is in.
You kick off the book with a preface about how you became an agricultural economist. It all started with you sitting in one of your friend's classes. Talk to me about what changed for you in that particular class.
I think even getting on into grade 12, I didn't even know what agricultural economists actually do and what are the agricultural economists. I went to university in Alice, University of Fort Hare. That's where I got my first degree. And the idea going there was to go and study for the Bachelor of Accounting. We were supported by the SAICA, South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. But it was only a month in where I interacted a lot with some of the agricultural students. I went to some of their classes. I was in their residence, where my mind actually got to change. But I think at the core of that was really the idea of understanding on where our food was coming from, how is the global food market actually playing out, because that was a time where we had a global food crisis in the world, and there was a lot of that material that was coming up in our classes. But I think also it linked to the roots of where I'm coming from, because in the Transkei, we have a lot of agriculture that is happening, but at a small scale side. Now, the motivation was to say, can this agriculture at a small scale side be able to be reshaped to the extent that it can be a source of economic opportunities for people in those areas? And I got to really be interested on that, and I studied it, and then going on into a graduate school in Stellenbosch, where the idea was really onto that. And obviously these days I spend a bit of more time either looking at commodity markets or on a policy side, but I think the roots are coming from that.
You start off the chapter looking at land reform. What were your thoughts on the early days around the land reform debate and how it unfolded?
I mean, I think the early days, the whole story for me on the land reform, when I did the bachelor's degree sitting on it at Fort Hare, we were doing a lot of work that was on the agricultural development side and thinking about that work. Then fast forward to go to grad school, a lot of work that we did was more on the policy side. And some of the areas that I spent a lot of my time doing, I was writing a lot about land reform and all of those things in an academic way. Now, fast forward, I get to a working environment, and the discussion on land reform was still pretty much the same like what I experienced when I was in school, until the issue of expropriation pretty much heated up. And I felt that the way we were discussing about it, yes, it was justifiable if one is looking at it in a historical perspective, but we had to consider also the economic perspective of the argument. Hence, I felt that it was important for us to begin now also writing some work, and I put up a number then of essays where I was coming on not so much on a historical perspective, but on an economic perspective of land reform, but obviously sensitive sensitive to all of the issues that are around it. And starting up the book really started off with a preface of my personal story, introducing the reader to who I am, and then straight after that getting on a land reform story, which takes up almost half of the book, because we deal with the issues that were happening at that point, but also offering some of the views where I think maybe it's the path that as South Africa we should be considering going forward.
Leadership is very important, and in some of your columns you've written about Minister Thoko Didiza and about some of the things that she needs to be focusing on. How confident are you that the leadership will be able to get some of the things right? I mean, you also talk about how Thoko Didiza has some of her battle scars with her.
Minister Didiza is one of the experienced agriculture ministers that we have. I mean, in the early 90s, she was in the sector, and she carried through agricultural development and land reform matters. And I think that the space that she was outside also of government somewhat offered a perspective to be on a private citizen and also private businesses on how actually some of these things could be done better. Her now coming back, I think that it offers the country at least some bit of hope that it's someone that is experienced, but also her strong leadership, I think, is one of the things that is gonna be leader. But she has a number of challenges, which I explain in the book, because firstly, she has to align the philosophical side of both the departments that she's merging and ensure that there is a plan going forward, and also there is a private sector buy-in on whatever plan that is going to be there going forward. Because the reality is the South African agricultural sector right now, capital intensive, driven by private sector participation. So I think her openness and the way of negotiation with the private sector is one of the things that will really be tested and important. But obviously those are that I had to write about the leadership story because I felt that that was necessary.
Let's discuss your thoughts on the agricultural subsectors that have the potential to boost economic development in some of the rural areas. And perhaps you can mention some of them that people may not necessarily be aware of.
One of the reasons we really focus a lot on agriculture in South Africa is really about two things. You have this twin challenge that you are facing, high unemployment, really slow economic activity in some of the rural South Africa. And then the key challenge there is to say, how do you get those people working and get those areas to be active? Agriculture is the closest thing that can actually do that. What we do in the book, though, we try to say, reflecting on what NDP has said and many other people and our studies have actually said, to map up to say what subsectors should we really be focusing on. If I'm putting money in Transkei, what should I be planting? Should I be planting maize or what? And then those we say in the horticulture cluster side, it's what is really preferred. By horticulture, it's really the fruit and vegetables. The key thing for that is because they are high value, they are labor intensive, that's why one prefers those areas. But obviously there are areas where horticulture can't do well, which is where then the livestock sector gets to be important. And we've seen examples of how those benefits through the BKB wool programs that have been running out of the Eastern Cape. But we map those in the book to say this is where the focus should be for rural development.
Cannabis has been one of the topics that everybody spoke about at least over the past couple of years, and the topic started to become quite, hotly contested. But we've also seen legislations in some parts of the world start to relax when it comes to the rules around cannabis. What kind of spin-offs are you seeing on the economic side when it comes to cannabis and how it can boost some of the economies?
I mean, we couldn't write a book about agricultural development in this day and not talk about cannabis. The thinking for us was that for South Africa, we do know that there are certain areas that have been growing it in the shadows of the law. You think of Transkei and all of those areas, we've seen anecdotal evidence of those cases. But now, obviously, the discussion is picking up. You hear the finance minister and many other guys really elevating the discussion in the right place. And I think rightly so, but I think where South Africa should be focusing it a lot, at least in the current moment, is making sure that we craft regulations in the right way. Because while we know that there could be job creation, there could be certain billions of rents that could be generated through export revenue and also some of the other products that can be derived out of this medical as well as on the industrial side. But I think the immediate near-term thing is really setting up the regulations right, and in setting up those regulations, ensuring that at least the small-scale farmers are not taken out of the chain. Because some of the examples that we've seen on our neighboring countries is that the issuance of the licenses on cannabis gets to be so expensive to the extent that they are exclusionary to the very same poor small-scale farmers that maybe it might been intended for. So for South Africa, really in the book, I dive in onto that, what are the benefits, as well as what regulatory framework should be set up and how that should be set up, and which players should really come to the table, and also which areas should we really be focused on making sure that we create cannabis value chains in there so that new jobs and new activity could really come out.
Well, that's it from me. Until next time, we'll have more of your news after the break with Nzinga Kunti.